Welcome to the second episode of the Vandenberg Coalition's new series, China in the Homeland. I am your host, Thor Mortensen. In this series, we will speak with guests about China's growing influence in the United States, how it affects everyday Americans, and what we can do to stop it. This is an all-hands-on-deck crisis, and we need state governments in on the most critical fight of our lifetime. China has identified college campuses as one of the largest gateways into American society. They've snuck into our classrooms with the goal of disseminating their ideology at all costs. They've even gone so far as to instruct their nationals in the U.S. to disrupt events featuring speakers that challenge Chinese talking points. They have stolen our research to build weapons they can use against us, and a host of other disturbing moves. As they stand, our institutions of higher education have become some of the most significant targets for bad actors in this country. Their blatant assault on the places meant to encourage honesty and meticulousness demonstrates why we have chosen this issue as our first pillar of China's threats to the homeland. In this episode, we're thrilled to be joined by two great partners of the Vandenberg Coalition. Jackie Deal is one of our wonderful advisory board members. She is the co-founder of the American Academy for Strategic Education, which offers courses to early to mid-career national security officials on China, net assessments, and political warfare. She is also president of the Long-Term Strategy Group and serves on the advisory board of State Armor, whose CEO, Michael Lucci, we heard from in the previous episode. She has testified before Congress and state legislatures on the rising threat of China, dynamics of the CCP, and U.S.-China relations broadly. We are also excited to welcome Jenna Robinson, president of the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal, an organization based in Raleigh, North Carolina, whose goal is to renew and fulfill the promise of higher education in North Carolina and beyond. Jenna has been at the Martin Center since 2007 after serving as the E.A. Morris Fellowship Assistant at the John Locke Foundation. She serves on the board of the Alumni Free Speech Alliance, the UNC Alumni Free Speech Alliance, the steering committee of the Bastiat Society of Raleigh, and as a member of the Board of Visitors at UNC Chapel Hill. Jackie and Jenna, thank you very much for joining us. We're excited to have you. In our last episode, we had two Michaels. In this episode, we have Jackie and Jenna, so we're keeping the alliteration theme going here. And to start off, I'm going to just ask each of you to weigh in on why you think colleges and universities specifically are targeted by China in their United Front strategy. We'll go ahead and start with Jackie and then bounce to Jenna.
Great. Thanks, Thor. And thank you to Vandenberg for doing this series, and great to be with you and with Jenna. Thank you for the important work you do. I think the Chinese Communist Party has identified universities as a very important target because of the overall strategy of the CCP to gain wealth and power at the expense of the rest of the world, and especially at the expense of the United States, which is seen as the primary adversary or rival. There is a view that U.S. universities are hubs of innovation, intellectual property, and shaping the future in terms of young minds and people who will go on to be in positions of influence and power in our society. Also, the Chinese Communist Party itself was founded at a university in China. So universities are held in high esteem as places that will hold especially important influence down the road. And from the beginning, the Chinese Communist Party has successfully infiltrated its rivals' schools in order to gain resources, intellectual property, know-how, followers, recruits, at the expense of their targets and at the expense of freedom of inquiry and kind of transparent functioning of those institutions. I think our universities are directly in the crosshairs, and they're not adequately defending themselves against this form of attack from the Chinese Communist Party. As you mentioned, we're seeing students on American campuses deprived of free speech and freedom of inquiry. We're seeing espionage, the theft of important intellectual property developments and achievements. We're seeing whole swaths of kind of the next generation and important young minds shaped into misunderstanding the character of the Chinese Communist Party and the threat that the United States faces from it, because activists on campus, whether because they actually believe in the Chinese Communist Party's ideology or because they're being threatened and coerced into advancing it, are spreading Chinese Communist Party propaganda. So there's a whole a swath or spectrum of threats and attacks happening on our campuses, and our universities, I think, have been turning a blind eye. There are research security offices and student rights offices, are meager. Often it's, two or three, a handful of individuals. They don't understand the character of the threat. They don't have the resources to address it. So as a result, we're seeing, huge transfers of U.S. intellectual property and know-how, and uh, from the U.S. to the PRC, in part through known mechanisms like talent programs and Chinese Scholarship Council um, uh, programs to exfiltrate U.S. know-how, and then we're also seeing American students or other foreign students and other Chinese students deprived of the rights that they should have and the privileges they should have on U.S. campuses, which is really shocking and a real threat to, again, the future generations and leaders of our country.
Yeah, that's great. And thanks for that overview of kind of how the United Front strikes. Jenna, do you have anything to weigh in on that point with?
Yes. First, thank you for having me here. This is a great opportunity. And I'll just echo what Jackie said, that universities are a gateway for the Chinese Communist Party. And I think they've targeted universities for two reasons. The first, Jackie mentioned industrial espionage. They want to steal intellectual property, trade secret, proprietary information, and innovations. Our universities do a lot of cutting edge research, and some Chinese scientists, not all, come here to learn about our new technologies and take them back to China, where intellectual property protections are much weaker. But also, they say they're here to promote Chinese culture. But I think we have to be very clear that when it's being done by the Chinese government, it's not promotion of Chinese culture, it's promotion of the Chinese government. And universities are an ideal place to do this because they are already hubs for spreading information and ideas. They are set up to spread information and ideas. And so, why not use the infrastructure of an institution that already exists to spread your own misinformation? And I think the Chinese government has figured that out.
Well, thank you both for outlining sort of the idea that China uses to target our institutions. Jenna, going to you, both of you sort of alluded to their cultural mechanisms, or at least a facade of a cultural mechanism that they use on our campuses, and that's the Chinese Students and Scholars Associations. People may be more familiar with their predecessors, the Confucius Institutes, but I'd love for you to ask how CSSAs play a role in China's strategy on our college campuses, and if there's any examples of universities or state governments taking both positive and perhaps negative action toward them.
Mhm. So I think there are a few things to know about CSSAs. I think the first thing to know is that these are Chinese government created organizations. They're not organic, and some of what they do is nefarious. The first thing that they do is they spy on their own people, right? They're trying to control and monitor the speech of Chinese students and professors who are here in the United States, and they're taking that information back to the Chinese government. And so, as Jackie mentioned earlier, students and professors who are here in this country don't necessarily enjoy the freedoms that they ought to have on a university campus because they're being watched, they're being spied on by their own people. We also know that some CSSA chapters have pressured American universities to cancel talks that are critical of the Chinese government. So topics like Tibet or Chinese democracy or the treatment of Uyghurs or Hong Kong, these are off limits, and you'll see protests and pressure to stop those events from happening on campus. They also have what is called the Thousand Talents Program. I think it might have been renamed, but it's a program by the Chinese government to recruit experts in science and technology from abroad mostly from overseas Chinese communities. And a big part of this is to recruit American-trained Chinese scientists to return to China after earning a PhD here, presumably bringing with them all of the intellectual property and innovations that they have worked on while doing their PhD work in American universities. And of course, they are part of industrial espionage. Um, we haven't seen a lot of activity from states on CSSAs yet, but we did with Confucius Institutes. I think it took a while for states to wake up and realize what Confucius Institutes really were, because as you said, it sounds innocuous. Sharing Chinese culture is something that everyone can get excited about. It's fun to learn about new cultures. That's something we do at universities. And so I think that the awareness about what CSSAs really are, and that they are an arm of the Chinese government, and all of the things that they're doing. We need more awareness of that. We need state actors to become more aware of that, and then we might see some activity.
Great, thanks. That was a really in-depth answer that I appreciate you bringing it back to the state action there. And something you mentioned was the research that's being done by Chinese students who then go back to China. And that's something I'd like to ask you about, Jackie, is something that we've seen happening in this plot from the United Front is research theft. Can you talk a little bit about how widespread it is, what type of research Chinese students are doing here that they then take back to China, and how it could potentially be used against us as Americans?
Sure. And just to kind of bridge from the last question or give you a specific example from a state, there was a case in Florida, at the University of Florida, where the head of the chapter of the Chinese Students and Scholars Association on that campus, who was actually not studying biology, managed to get a position in a lab on campus and was, through that affiliation, able to order biological specimens, agents that are export controlled, or at least the allegation was that she then secured these biomaterials, and working with other individuals, the allegation was that she was sending them, or they were sending them, to the PRC when that was not supposed to be happening under our export controls. So that was a case where there was a direct connection between a CSSA leader and the exfiltration or extraction from our country of sensitive biomaterials that could presumably be used to cause disease, or advance know-how related to bio threats and weapons. There are other cases recently in the state of Michigan where researchers there who were originally from the PRC were alleged to have been importing other kinds of fungus and crop diseases that could have posed a threat, or could pose a threat to the health of our agricultural land and our soil. There has been a series of reports, excellent research investigations by the Select Committee of the House of Representatives on the competition with the Chinese Communist Party. And these reports, I believe, began with one from 2024 called CCP on the Quad, looking at U.S. government and specifically defense and intelligence community funding of research on U.S. campuses, and the way that those projects or grants were being executed in conjunction with Chinese or PRC-based partners. And in many cases, the partners were directly affiliated with the Chinese military. So effectively, we have our national security apparatus funding the advancement of the Chinese military and intelligence state through these partnerships that the grantees were engaging in. And the numbers were kind of shocking, or should be very alarming to Americans. The CCP on the Quad report looked at, I believe, roughly 10 years worth of publications from roughly 2015 to 2025, I believe, or something in that vicinity, and almost 9,000 publications with U.S. DoD or intelligence community funding were generated that had Chinese partners. And in, I think, roughly 2,000 of the cases, or almost 1,800 to 2,000 of the cases, the Chinese partners were directly working in, say, Chinese military labs or institutions. Even in the cases where the partners were at civilian universities, say, the issue is that in the People's Republic of China, even nominally civilian universities are party institutions and therefore subject to 2017 law from the party that says if you are a Chinese entity, whether a school or a business or an individual, and our intelligence, meaning the Chinese intelligence services, reaches out to you for information, you are obligated to turn it over. You are obligated also to deny that the request was made. The select committee then followed up with another report just in September of this year called Fox and the Hen Houses. Fox and the Hen House, looking again at more research funded by the U.S. Department of Defense or War, just looking at grants that were announced from June 2023 to June 2025. And again, they found thousands of publications, or maybe 1,400 publications jointly authored between American and Chinese researchers. And again, in many cases, roughly half, I believe, the partners on the Chinese side were directly working with the Chinese military. Because Jenna is in North Carolina, I just checked to see in that data how many of those cases involve North Carolina institutions. And I think the North Carolina share was roughly 79 publications and 8 grants worth over $11.5 million. Again, just from the most recent select committee report on this issue. So tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars worth of taxpayer money is going to fund the rise of the PLA effectively through these grants and the partnerships with Chinese co-authors.
Those numbers coming from the select committee are just really jaw-dropping, and I am so glad that you were able to share those with our audience. It really proves the importance of the select committee's work, and we're happy to have them as a resource for all Americans. So we certainly encourage all listeners to check those out. Jenna, moving to you, President Trump recently made headlines with his decision to issue 600,000 visas to Chinese students, which has been a major discussion on all sides of the political spectrum in the last few months. When I talk to people, I hear two sides of that issue. On the one hand, a lot of people will tell me that the American higher education system will collapse without tuition coming from foreign students, a very large portion of whom come from China. And then on the other hand, you have the former chairman of the select committee, Mike Gallagher, who wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this summer saying the national security risks are too grave to let in any Chinese students at this point. Where do you fall on that issue, and how should we weigh those two arguments?
Right. So I see the point in both of those arguments, and my position is to weigh the cost and the benefits, and also to not treat all potential Chinese students like a monolith, right? Some of them are here because they want to learn, and some of them are here because they want to spy, and it should be our duty and our prerogative to figure out who is who. Because, there is a real talent benefit, and universities do benefit, of course, from those tuition dollars. But according to data from the U.S. Department of Energy, 92% of Chinese scientists who receive a PhD in the United States in 2002 were still in the U.S. in 2007 working. And I'm in favor of a vibrant economy and an immigration system that prioritizes talent. And our universities are enabling that. On the other hand, I don't want students and scholars to come here for the purposes of espionage or undermining our American system. And so I think the solution has to be better vetting rather than just an arbitrary limit on the number of Chinese students we let in. And, that is something that our immigration system should really be tasked with. Right now, I think our immigration system is fairly arbitrary in how it decides to allow people to come. The rules they have set for allowing immigrants from various countries are not as well researched as they should be. And so I think, that is what we really need to do. We need to have better vetting of really anyone who's coming to this country.
Our previous limited podcast series from the summer, The Other Superpower, discussed how China and Iran aid each other in sowing discord in American society. We all saw that play out on our college campuses in the last 2 years following Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel, with encampments and just general disruption across the country. We learned in that podcast that we issued that Iran and China coordinate to sow distrust between students and other parts of society in America. Jackie, can you explain the goal behind that and maybe how TikTok plays a role?
Sure. Well, alarmingly, we're seeing through surveys, I think, run by Vandenberg and other fine institutions, that there is emerging a kind of gap, a generational division. And this is what I was getting at in my first answer, between young people who are getting their information from their feeds on TikTok, which is an algorithm, or has an algorithm engineered from Beijing, that is designed to do the work of the Chinese Communist Party and Iran with regard to kind of weakening faith or patriotism, um, with regard to the legitimacy of democracy, and our liberal rights-based system. We're seeing, shocking sentiments from young people who are being told on TikTok, apparently, that, Osama bin Laden wasn't a bad guy and neither was Hitler, and down is up and left is right. And so it's definitely incumbent upon all of us to do a better job teaching kids about civics and about being critical readers and consumers of information. And just to follow up on what Jenna was saying about being more discriminating or selective in to whom we issue visas. Um, of course, I believe that we should not be admitting PLA or MSS, Chinese military or intelligence agents to the United States to study. Um, I think we also have to consider that even kids who aren't party members or who are just here to study because it's their best option will come under pressure if they end up in an important lab or in the vicinity of intellectual property or elite access that the Chinese Communist Party is interested in, because we have let ourselves we've been so open that we have Chinese quote unquote overseas service stations in many of our major cities. We have consulates that are kind of overactive or hyperactive and reaching into our campuses through the Chinese Students and Scholars Association, as the US government has warned. So we have let the Chinese Communist Party's surveillance apparatus into our country and onto our campuses in a way where students are going to be put in the crosshairs, even if they don't intend to work for the Chinese intelligence state. And unfortunately, I think we can't protect them if they come under pressure. Maybe they'll be offered incentives to turn over information. We know that the Chinese Scholarship Council winners or students are obligated to turn over information. So we have to figure out, if they say no, can we protect their families back home from the stick side, or as opposed to the carrot side of the pressure that they will come under? I think the answer is no. And so I think we either have to kind of clean out the ability of the CCP to exercise such nefarious influence on our campuses, or we really do need to be much more selective and only take students from China whose families aren't at risk, therefore who will not be subject to that kind of coercive pressure or leverage from the CCP. Or maybe, just thinking broadly, when we admit Chinese students, we should give visas to their family members. I think that would be kind of a tough sell given our immigration posture in general, and maybe inadvisable for other reasons. But I think we need to be just much more kind of broad thinking and open to a whole host of other solutions. And I think we owe a debt, or Congressman Gallagher did a service by changing the conversation and offering a kind of new perspective on how we should be thinking about this issue of potentially hostile students, or even more importantly, perhaps at risk students. So maybe it's not moral to take these kids and then put them in the crosshairs when we can't protect their families back home.
One final question for each of you, drawing on the experience that both of you have had on the state level, is where are we in terms of policy making to protect our colleges and universities in this country? What should policymakers on the state level be doing? And what can students do to play a part in boosting national security at their schools? And I'll go ahead and ask Janice to start.
So I'm going to back up what the federal government can do first because I think it has a huge role to play here. And I think that the first thing we need to do is, pass the Deterrent Act. The House already did so, and it should be brought back up. And the Deterrent Act does a lot of really important things. It lowers the reporting threshold so that universities would have to report all foreign gifts greater than $50,000. It would create a $0 threshold for countries of concern, which include China. So that means every gift would have to be reported. And of course, the Education Department just took an important step. It announced a new portal for foreign gifts reporting, which I think is a great start. Um, the Deterrent Act would also make it so that institutions have to report foreign gifts and contracts received by individual faculty and staff members. Um, it would prohibit institutions from entering into contracts with a country of concern unless a waiver is granted. Um, it would require endowments to report foreign investments, and there would be stricter penalties for noncompliance than there are right now, where the penalties are almost non-existent. If you don't report, really nothing happens. And so I think that is a first step, and it is a step that states could take one at a time to say that you have to report foreign gifts because states have a lot of reporting requirements for their institutions. But I think this is a role that the federal government should play, is really keeping an eye on foreign gifts reporting. But the other thing that I think our universities should do, here in the States, is to, really to be aware, to start looking into their own CSSA organizations, to start looking into what is happening on their own campuses, to read the select committee report to see, uh, how many, North Carolina scholars are involved in getting these grants and then passing information essentially to the Chinese military. And I think that that is not happening. I think that our universities are ignorant of the threats. And so I think the first step is really to, do their homework, do their due diligence, and find out where the threats are on their own campuses, and then take steps.
Thanks, Jenna. Jackie, why don't you wrap it up for us?
Sure. Well, I agree that the federal government needs to do more and Congress needs to pass the Deterrent Act. And in the meantime, I also agree that states are stepping up. We've seen Florida and Texas pass laws. I mean, in our federal system, states actually have a lot of discretion over their universities. And they're passing versions of, Section 117 of the uh, Higher Ed Act, which requires disclosure of foreign gifts, and they're putting teeth on the penalties. So at the state level, Florida institutions and Texas universities now have to report or else, and there's real teeth there in terms of financial penalties. They're setting up rules or standards by which you're not allowed as an individual employed by the state at a state university to accept foreign gifts um, or enter into partnerships either individually or institutionally, unless you receive some sort of national security exemption from, say, a higher ed board and state authorities with the federal authorities, which I think is a good model in terms of shifting from a kind of uh, default of openness that is clearly causing us harm and damage to one of much more kind of vigilance and common sense security focus. So I'm impressed by what the leadership really of Florida and Texas and other states that are considering similar measures on these issues. And I have to say I'm disappointed at this point in what's happened at the federal level and what's not happened at our universities. Frankly, we've seen a series of shocking reports out of Stanford, which is perhaps the leading research university in the United States. I think it was last May that undergraduates reported in the Stanford Review that there's a problem at Stanford of Chinese Ministry of State Security intelligence agents in the vicinity, in the area, posing as students and targeting Stanford undergraduates, trying to induce them to come to China, surveilling them, reaching out on China's social media like WeChat, and speaking to them in Chinese and telling them not to report various things. And according to that story, Blockbuster, really, in Stanford Review, the Stanford administration has actually known about this problem, and there's been a kind of culture of silence, I think was their term, around it. Then there was a follow up very recently. um, so we're recording in early December. Just yesterday, we saw that the Stanford Review exposed that one of the leading faculty at Stanford in the field of nuclear physics is actually cooperating with China's nuclear program and educating students at Stanford who then go back and join China's nuclear weapons program using U.S. federal funds, and access to facilities like SLAC, um, a national lab on Stanford's campus. So this is a crazy situation, especially because the Hoover Institution at Stanford is considered one of the kind of national leaders on research security, and one part of a $67 million US government National Science Foundation grant in 2024 that was kind of follow on to the CHIPS and Science Act on research security. So they are supposed to be in a leading role on safeguarding our universities and the research that goes on there. And yet we're seeing Stanford undergraduates expose massive problems at Stanford. So, I mean, you would think kind of step one is removing the threats or safeguarding Stanford, and then proceeding to the rest of the United States and our other fine institutions. But we're not really even at step one, which is quite concerning. So I guess just to wrap up, I think where this leaves us is, if you see something, say something. Be like the fine undergraduates at Stanford, the journalists at Stanford Review who are exposing this kind of incredible and very disturbing situation. Um, you know, it's sort of like we're back to where we were after 9/11, with a very different kind of threat. But we all need to be vigilant, and when we see people being harassed or repressed and targeted on our campuses, we need to report that and educate our faculty. And when we see people, engaging in theft or espionage-like activity, that can't go unreported. And so I really commend the fine work of the Stanford Review undergrads.
Generally when we talk about what goes on the American college campus, despite those institutions being supposed to be about knowledge and wisdom, we end up walking away with our minds boggled. And you two have been able to very much clearly cut the threats and demonstrate why it's important to be aware of what China's doing on our college campuses. So I really appreciate you both taking the time to talk to me this morning, and I know our listeners very much appreciate it as well.
Thanks, Thor.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to China in the Homeland, a production of the Vandenberg Coalition. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, rate, leave a review, and tune in again as we explore the role of states in confronting the China challenge. Also, please follow our account on X @VandenbergCo, visit www.vandenbergcoalition.org, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter, Beyond the Water's Edge, to keep up to date on all our other projects. Until next time, I'm Thor Mortensen, and this has been China in the Homeland.